Coming up on KCCI 8 News Close Up, a political newcomer pulls off a major upset in the Republican primary for governor. How Zach Lane defeated a Trump-backed congressman. Democrats believe they have their best chance in years to win statewide in Iowa. Why national political observers are paying close attention. And Iowa's 3 congressional races are already becoming political battlegrounds. Why what happens in our state could help decide which party controls Congress.
You're watching KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Good morning. Thank you for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. I'm Chief Political Reporter Amanda Rooker. Well, the primary election is over. The November matchups are set, and Iowa suddenly one of the most closely watched political states in the country. Now, that may come as a surprise, in part because Donald Trump won Iowa by 13 percentage points in the 2024 election. That's a historically large margin, as you can see right here. Republicans in Iowa have spent the last decade tightening their grip on state government. But for the first time in years, Democrats believe Iowa is truly in play. The Iowa governor's race is expected to be one of the most competitive in the country. The U.S. Senate race here could help determine which party has power in Washington. And 3 of Iowa's 4 congressional districts are expected to be battlegrounds this fall. This morning, we're taking a closer look at the candidates, the races, and why Iowa matters. Now, Tuesday's Republican primary election delivered one of the biggest surprises in Iowa politics. For months, many viewed Republican Congressman Randy Feenstra as the favorite to become Iowa's next governor. He had statewide name recognition, strong fundraising, and a last-minute endorsement from President Donald Trump. But when the votes were counted, it was political newcomer Zach Lane who earned his party's pick. Now, Lane won by less than a percentage point, earning about 38% of the vote. He narrowly cleared the 35% threshold needed to avoid a state convention.
We the people. Let's go!
Businessman and a former conservative political operative who started this race virtually unknown. Now, on the campaign trail, he repeatedly raised concerns about Iowa's rising cancer rates, declining water quality, and young people leaving our state. He also embraced the Make America Healthy Again movement, arguing that it's time to take on special interests and return power to everyday Iowans.
We were outspent, opposed by the establishment, told to wait our turn. Well, tonight the people of Iowa had something to say about that
Now, Lane has to bring Republicans back together after a bruising 5-way primary race. And waiting for him is Democrat Rob Sand. Sand did not have a primary challenger. The state auditor is Iowa's only statewide elected Democrat, and he has spent the last year traveling Iowa, holding town halls, making the case that one-party Republican control here is not working.
My campaign has been very clearly focused on the idea of a state that isn't redder or bluer, but that is better and truer. There are people who are fed up with the state's direction. They see the work that I've done. They hear my message. They hear my disgust with both of the private clubs that run our state. I'm talking about the 2 major political parties.
While Republicans were fighting through a primary, Sand was building a campaign war chest. His campaign reported about $18 million cash on hand, giving Democrats hope that they really can compete statewide. But Republicans point to Iowa's recent voting history and a significant voter registration advantage. And the fight is already underway. Lane has tried to paint Sand as too liberal for Iowa. Meanwhile, Sand has questioned Lane's ties to the state, pointing to reports that he maintains a home in Kansas and frequently flies there on a private plane. Now, those attacks are likely just the beginning. High-profile national election forecasters, including Sabado's Crystal Ball, say this race is a toss-up. Well, I'm joined now by J. Miles Coleman. He is the associate editor of Sabado's Crystal Ball. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thanks for having me.
Well, we want to start by talking about Iowa's governor's race. Your organization recently changed the rating of this race to the most competitive toss-up category. What was it about this race that put it over the edge to be put into that toss-up category?
Yeah, sure. This is something that we had been thinking of, a change we had been thinking of making for some time. We did get some kind of clarity after the primary, so that kind of pushed us kind of in that way. So basically what this means is Iowa, is usually not the, 50-50 or even Democratic leaning state it was, during the Obama times. That said, you look at a year like 2018, which was Trump's last midterm, the Democrats still lost the governorship, but it was close. It was within a few points. We're looking at basically a similar type of national environment this year. I think the Democrats do have, they have their strongest potential candidate in State Auditor Rob Sand. He fundraised as well. He's known as kind of a strong retail politician. I think probably one of the other things is, Iowa being a red state, one of the things we see, a key ingredient when kind of states that lean lopsidedly one way kind of break the other way, especially in governor's races, is if the incumbent party tends to overreach or is not popular, which is more or less exactly the case in Iowa, where Governor Reynolds, who's been there for I think almost a decade at this point, she usually ranks as one of the least popular governors. She's a Republican, so that's probably something that could help the Democrats. In the Republican primary, there was a bit of an upset with Zach Lane upsetting Congressman Feenstra. Lane is a bit of an outsider, so I wonder if that would be kind of play to his advantage in a race like this.
Now that Lane is the Republican nominee, Democrats, are already kind of taking their aim at him, criticizing some of his questions about ties to Kansas and his plane flights back there. On the other hand, Democrats have been thinking that Sand was going to be running against Feenstra, who may have struggled with the grassroots. Zach Lane kind of has proved that he is able to connect with the grassroots conservatives here. He is arguably stronger on retail politics, charismatic. Which one of those arguments do you think kind of wins out in how strong of a candidate Lane is?
I do think probably Lane is his retail politics strength probably helped in a primary like this. But compared to Feenstra, I think he is still a bit more of a wild card or an unproven candidate in the general elections. So, we're going to have to kind of see how he does kind of in that general election environment.
Well, Miles, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights. We really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you so much.
And Close Up, we'll be right back after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Close Up. The race for Iowa's open U.S. Senate seat is already drawing national attention. Republicans are defending a seat that they've held for decades. Meanwhile, Democrats believe they have a candidate who can compete statewide in a way that few Democrats have in recent years. After Tuesday's primary election, Republican Ashley Hinson will face Democrat Josh Turek in a race that could help decide control of the U.S. Senate.
Josh Turek won decisively Tuesday night, defeating Zach Walz in a high-profile Democratic primary. The Council Bluffs native spent months arguing he could win support from more than just Democrats.
Whether you are a Republican, an independent, or a Democrat, there is room here for you in our campaign.
The two-term state lawmaker and Paralympic gold medalist was born with spina bifida. He says his story reflects the challenges everyday Iowans are facing. Turek's campaign was buoyed by millions in outside spending that helped him put up TV ads. Turek argues he's the candidate best positioned to flip Iowa's U.S. Senate seat for the first time in decades.
I've had to fight my whole life, and this is what is needed in D.C.
After clinching his party's nomination, Turek took aim at his new opponent.
Ashley Hinson is a multimillionaire who has increased her wealth by up to 10 times since she got to Congress. She does not represent Iowa and does not represent our values. And tonight, Iowa, we have had enough.
Republican Ashley Hinson easily defeated her primary challenger, Jim Carlin, on Tuesday. The three-term congresswoman enters the race with the backing of President Trump and was quick to call Turek too liberal for Iowa.
While he's been masquerading as a good old Iowa moderate, he is nothing of the sort. In fact, he supports and will fight for the same radical and destructive policy agenda that pushed America to her breaking point and left you all to foot the bill.
The early attacks offer a glimpse into what could become one of the most closely watched Senate races in the country.
Both national parties are already focused on this race. Republicans currently control the U.S. Senate, and that makes it somewhat easier for them to pass President Trump's agenda through Congress. Democrats want to change that. They're trying to win back the majority. But to do that, they'll need to flip Republican-held Senate seats around the country, and that includes Iowa. Well, I'm joined now by Jessica Taylor. She's the Senate and Governor's editor for the nonpartisan election forecaster, The Cook Political Report. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Iowa's U.S. Senate race. It's gaining a lot of national attention and chatter right now, despite the fact that Democrats haven't won a U.S. Senate seat in Iowa since 2008. The Cook Political Report recently shifted the Iowa Senate race from likely Republican to lean Republican. Tell me about that change and how you're viewing this race.
This means we still see Republicans as having the advantage, but I think with a nominee like State Representative Josh Turek, there is a lot more interest from national Democrats in the contest. And with the worsening national environment, with the ongoing Iran war, you had a report from Politico this week that Ashley Hinson even expressing concern over the political implications of the ongoing war. And I think that it's having particular effects nationwide, but I think in Iowa on diesel prices, on fertilizer prices, the effects that it's having on farmers. So this is a race that certainly national Democrats feel like is moving up their target list.
And clearly, national Democrats preferred Josh Turek over Zach Walz in this race. Josh Turek won pretty decisively on Tuesday night. But if you look at substance and policy-wise, both of those candidates were pitching a public option healthcare system, anti-corporate influence, some progressive type policy styles. However, Josh Turek has campaigned on his ability to kind of win over independents and Republicans. Is it his personal story, his record of being able to win over a more kind of moderate base in the Iowa House that kind of paints him as a more electable candidate to the National Democratic Party?
I think it's both of those things. I mean, he certainly has a compelling personal story, and I think you will hear a lot about being a Paralympian. His videos have shown him literally climbing up steps to meet with voters, getting out of his wheelchair and hoisting himself up. I think that the history that he has there in winning in conservative districts before will help. And I think that national Republicans are already quick out of the gate. They are painting him as a national Democrat and liberal on some specific policy issues. So whether we have national Republicans that are going to super PACs that have already reserved, I think, $26 million. The National Democratic Super PAC has also reserved about half of that. But I think that, I'm watching to see if his fundraising takes off. He hasn't been a particularly strong fundraiser fundraiser. He had the money from VoteVets that came in and I think really moved the race in his direction. But Ashley Henson, I think, is a very formidable candidate. She's been a very strong fundraiser. So we're not saying that Turek is the favorite in this race. Ashley Henson is still the favorite, but we just see it as a more competitive contest.
In the Cook Political Report election analysis, you kind of described this election as a battle between two powerful forces, voters who may be unhappy with President Trump's handlings of issues like the economy and tariffs, and Iowa's increasingly Republican voting habits. Can you kind of unpack that tension and what you'll be watching for?
Well, I think you're going to hear Turek talk about himself being sort of a different type of Democrat. He, of course, was endorsed by former Senator Tom Harkin, the last Democrat to hold this seat, to represent Iowa in the Senate. When I've talked with Turek before, he talks a lot about his prairie populism. So I think that, he's pitching himself as someone in the mold of Harkin. And I think that potentially has a lot of credibility with voters that voted for Harkin. Turek has been critical of President Trump, of course. And so I think that as you see President Trump's falling approval ratings, even in a state that he carried by 13 points, what impact that will have on the race, I think will be key. Another thing that makes national Democrats more, I think, bullish on this state is the governor's race as well. They feel like that State Auditor Rob Sand is for I think as strong as a candidate as Henson is. Sand is as strong a candidate as Democrats could have gotten in that gubernatorial race. So I've certainly talked with sources that just worry about the down ballot effect that Sand could have on the Senate race, on a race separate from his.
If you look at just the past several presidential elections and the voter demographics in Iowa, you see the shift from Obama to Trump voters. I'm wondering how you see Iowa nationally, whether or not it's a bellwether for the rest of the country in terms of how middle class or rural type working class voters, how they feel right now between these two political parties.
I think that if national Democrats are going to be successful, they have to be able to compete in places like Iowa. They have not done a good job of winning back rural voters. And in order to win back the Senate, national Democrats have to compete in states that Trump won by double digits. Again, as you mentioned, this is a place that has a lot of Obama-Trump counties. And so I think that the argument that you'll see Democrats making is that Republicans have gone too far to the right and that it's somewhere sort of back toward the middle. And if Democrats can argue that they are that middle of the road approach, this could be really competitive. I actually think out of all of I cover the entire United States, and if I could pick one state to tell me what the results would be come November, it would be Iowa. Because I think it is so pivotal in the race for the Senate as Democrats try to pick up governors. Iowa is one of their top pickup potentials in the races for governor that are up this cycle. And then, of course, there are several competitive House seats, as many as 3 competitive House seats as well. So I think that Iowa is really at the center of the nation right now when it comes to these elections, which is, not a place that it's not unused to being when you have the Iowa caucuses. And I think Iowa voters take that responsibility very seriously of getting to know the candidates. And so I think that, for instance, I think in the race for governor, a big mistake that Randy Feenstra made was sort of underestimating how you need to campaign in a grassroots style, skipping debates. So I think that, Iowa voters expect to meet the candidates and to get to know them. And so I think that you'll see candidates on both sides of the aisle in both these races for Senate and for governor taking that type of approach.
Well, Jessica, thank you so much for joining us and for your insight. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
And Close Up, we'll be right back after this break. Stay with us. Welcome back to Close Up. Now, if Republicans want to keep control of the U.S. House, Iowa will be one of the states they'll need to defend. 3 of Iowa's 4 congressional districts are expected to be competitive this fall, giving Democrats multiple opportunities to gain ground. In District 1, incumbent Republican Representative Marinette Miller Meeks will face Christina Bohannon for the 3rd time. Their last race was one of the closest in the country.
We came so incredibly close. We lost by just 799 votes out of 413,000. So, we think that's great momentum to build on.
Meanwhile, Miller Meeks has represented Iowa in Congress since 2021. She is defending her seat in southeastern Iowa. It is one of the most competitive congressional districts in the country.
Because I'm a fighter. I know who I represent, I know who I serve, and I know what I'm fighting for. And I will never back up, and I will never back down, and I will never back out fighting for you.
Now, in central Iowa, Republican Congressman Zach Nunn is seeking another term. He's facing Democratic State Senator Sarah Trone-Garriott. Now, Nunn has received Trump's endorsement, and Vice President J.D. Vance recently traveled to Iowa to campaign for him. Now, Trone-Garriott has built a reputation for winning difficult races in Republican-leaning areas. Democrats believe she gives them a strong chance to flip the seat. In Northeast Iowa, both parties are competing for an open congressional seat. Republicans nominated former State Representative Joe Mitchell, while Democrats chose State Representative Lindsey James. Now, this district still leans Republicans, but national forecasters recently moved the race into a more competitive category. Taken all together, those 3 races, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, will help determine whether Democrats can gain seats in the U.S. House and whether Iowa's recent Republican trend continues this November. Now, the District 4 seat is less competitive. It covers northwest Iowa and is considered to be likely safe for Republicans. Republican Chris McGowan will face Democrat Dave Dawson there. When we return, some big shakeups in Polk County races, how the leadership landscape could look much different for Iowa's most populous county. One of the most closely watched local races of Tuesday's primary ended with a political veteran knocking off an incumbent. Democrat John Forbes won his party's nomination in District 1, unseating incumbent Matt McCoy. No one ran for the seat in the Republican primary. KCCI's Kayla James talked with Forbes about his victory and what's next.
No matter the number of elections, John Forbes has won as a state representative.
Well, I was overwhelmed last night with the support that voters gave me in electing me to the Polk County Board of Supervisors.
His feelings from Tuesday night's primary election are genuine. Forbes beat incumbent Matt McCoy in the Democratic primary with 60% of the vote. No one ran the Republican primary.
I'm really excited about taking on this new challenge.
In a new role, but still one as a public servant. Forbes, a well-known pharmacist who owned Medicap pharmacies in the area until 2022, has spent nearly 2 decades serving Iowans. Most recently, he was a state representative in the Iowa House for 6 terms, retiring at the end of 2024.
Polk County has about a $365 million budget. And so knowing how to work with budgets, how to balance budgets, and being able to determine where money goes to where it benefits people the most here in Polk County is something that I've worked on in the state capitol, and I want to continue to do that as Polk County supervisor.
District 1 is made up of portions of Des Moines and West Des Moines, Clive, and Windsor Heights. McCoy was elected to the seat in 2018. Prior to that, he served 6 terms in the Iowa Senate and 2 terms in the Iowa House. KCCI didn't hear back from McCoy when reaching out Wednesday, but Forbes says he spoke with him Tuesday night.
He was very cordial and wants to work with me in the transition to the new board.
And Forbes, from talking to people in his district while campaigning, already has priorities in mind, such as focusing on housing and food insecurity and water quality.
Making sure that we continue to work with our farmers and representatives upstream to reduce the amount of nitrates that come into our water here in Polk County.
More than anything, Forbes says he's excited for the chance to continue giving back to the county he's lived in for more than 50 years.
I've raised my family here, my grandkids live here, and I want to make sure that we can put forward a good footprint for future generations.
Kayla James, KCCI 8 News, Iowa's news leader.
Another big change for this board. Democrat Heather Jones Brown narrowly defeated Joe Gatto to fill the open District 4 seat. Jones Brown won by just 42 votes. Well, thank you for joining us this morning. Have a great day.